So thank you all for coming today to hear Professor Pape speak about Syria. But before I present Professor Pape, I'd like to just say that today's event is hosted by SISTUP, which is the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Society, which is INTA's research policy research arm. And it's also sponsored by generous support from the Ray Davis Endowment. And this endowment, which was created to honor General Davis, who was Georgia Tech's Medal of Honor and an American hero in the Korean War, really affords the center the opportunity to bring to the campus some of the leading people in the world of academia and policy to really explore contemporary issues related to security challenges that are confronting the U.S. today and the global community. And I also would like to thank Faria for all of her logistical support in helping bring Professor Pape to town. So I am very pleased to introduce Professor Robert Pape, who was actually my academic advisor at University of Chicago, who I had the great privilege to work with, so I feel very honored that he's here today. Professor Pape is a professor of political science at University of Chicago, and he specializes in international security affairs, terrorism, air power, lots of other things, and now even more projects. His publications include the books Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War, and Cutting the Fuse, The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It. He's done work on economic sanctions, international moral action, humanitarian intervention, air power. He's also the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism, which is doing really cutting-edge research on suicide terrorism and just terrorism more generally now. His commentary on international security has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, the Bulletin for the Atomic Sciences, and many more. So we are very lucky to have him here today. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. Thanks. Thanks, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I haven't been at Georgia Tech before. It's really nice to see the campus. It's nice to see you folks. It's nice to renew some old acquaintances. And I especially want to say how wonderful it is for me to come and see Jenna in her new environment. When Jenna was at the University of Chicago, she was a central part of our intellectual community in our department. Those of you who have gotten to know Jenna, you can see some of the reasons why. She's brilliant, she's really productive, and she really takes community building seriously. A lot of people do well on one of those dimensions. It's really great when you have somebody who does well on all of those dimensions. And just from the dinner last night and everything I can see here, I can see that she's just right in a wonderful environment to continue all that here. So it's really terrific, Jenna. It's really wonderful. Today I want to talk about humanitarian intervention, which is the use of armed force by one state in the sovereign territory of another to prevent the target government from harming its citizens. This issue with Syria is obviously an important issue to talk about today, but I just want to remind you that the subject of humanitarian intervention has been one that's been around for many decades. Just in fact, in the last 4 decades, since 1990, the United States has led an international coalition for 4 successful humanitarian interventions. In the early 90s, to help the Kurds in northern Iraq. In the mid-90s, to help the Muslims in Bosnia. In the late 90s, to help another group of Muslims in Kosovo, and in 2011 to help yet another group of Muslims, this time near Benghazi, in Libya. In all 4 of those cases, the United States led an international coalition that successfully achieved the main goal of a humanitarian intervention, that is, saving lives. And in each of those cases, tens of thousands of lives were saved by those humanitarian interventions. Now, at the same time, in the last 20 years, there are some very famous cases of times we have not intervened. Rwanda, Darfur, and other cases, which brings us to the question, what humanitarian crises do and do not merit intervention? That's really the question I want to talk about today. Now, for many years, there has been a standard answer to that question by proposing humanitarian intervention. Whether we talk about the genocide standard embodied in the 1948 Convention or the relatively new responsibility to protect doctrine, those are specific manifestations of the basic arguments that when we observe mass atrocities, the existence of mass atrocities alone triggers a duty, a moral duty on our part to intervene in order to prevent those mass atrocities. The standard argument typically begins by quoting Kant, Immanuel Kant. He's one of the famous moral philosophers, who has a phrase in his work describing individuals as having equal moral worth because they are all members of the community of mankind. And therefore, we should not discriminate in the type of individuals, whether they're our citizens or citizens of other countries, that we would save. So in a sense, saving others is saving ourselves. That's a standard way to begin the argument on humanitarian intervention. I'm going to talk about that argument today in a little bit of depth in the context of Syria. But what I'm mainly going to do is present an alternative to that argument. That alternative I'm going to call the pragmatic standard of humanitarian intervention. It accepts the first point that mass atrocities trigger duties, moral duties, but not unconditionally. Not unconditionally. It's going to add a couple of additional features which I think are very important, not just for political purposes, although they are for that as well, but for moral purposes. This is an alternative moral standard of humanitarian intervention. And then what I'm going to do is apply it to Libya and then apply it to Syria so we can see how this would allow us to discriminate and develop policies in real-world cases so that we can actually save lives. That's the real objective. So what I want to do to begin is I just want to call attention to something you're probably already familiar with, which is standard dichotomy in the debate on humanitarian intervention, which pits liberal interveners opposed to realist opponents. If you open any page of Michael Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, especially the first 5 pages, or if you open any of Gary Bass's work, he's a professor at Princeton who's done a lot of work in humanitarian intervention, you will see a straightforward common dichotomy, which is the debate on humanitarian intervention for the last 200 years, actually, is described as a debate between liberals who think in terms of international norms and realists who think in terms of the national interest. And according to this crowd, if we could just get rid of those realists, if we could just overcome those realists, maybe we don't have to quite eliminate them, but maybe we could overwhelm them politically, then we'd have a lot more international intervention for humanitarian purposes. Well, I'm going to tell you that realists are not the problem. There is a problem, there are issues, but there are moral issues at stake, which are not commonly engaged by the current theory approach to humanitarian intervention by the proponents. But before we actually get to that, let me just develop this a little bit more of the standard approach in the context of Syria. Because in the context of Syria, we actually have not just general liberals who would support humanitarian intervention, but we have theorists of humanitarian intervention who are actually in the Obama administration running Syria policy. And basically, they're like an academic who's just kind of fulfilling their theory. It's actually kind of funny. Many academics from the University of Chicago are sometimes criticized as being ivory tower academics who just want to come to Washington to impose their theories. Well, I do observe that in this case, but they're not coming from Chicago. Samantha Power is a brilliant woman. She's a long-term advisor to President Obama way back before he was president, started when he was in the Senate, and she's written this really phenomenal book, very important book on humanitarian intervention called A Problem from Hell. Susan Rice is also in the administration. She has also been a long time proponent of humanitarian intervention and was one of the key sources for Samantha Power in her book, A Problem from Hell on Rwanda, because Susan Rice was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Clinton administration for Africa for Rwanda, basically during the Rwanda crisis. And so these are two folks who have long thought very, a lot about humanitarian intervention and essentially have accepted the standard liberal approach to humanitarian intervention. This is an approach which, let me just kind of map it out for you in a logic flow so you can follow it. And by the way, Gary Bass would agree with this. This is really quite a common approach and has been for about 200 years. That when there's a mass atrocity event, the key issue is to bring media coverage to that mass atrocity event. And that media coverage is then going to produce a shock to the public conscience, because now publics are going to understand the gravity of the evil and the awful things that are happening to human beings. And then once we have the mass atrocity with the media covering it in depth and the public shock, now we can bring public pressure against those political elites, the realist political elites, to overcome those realist obstacles to humanitarian intervention, and that's how we get humanitarian intervention. This is all the way through Samantha Power's book, this basic logic. And if you follow the way she has approached the problem in Syria and other issues, this is something that is not just a theory, this is something that's being put into practice. Well, if this were right, why don't we just sort of apply this logic a little bit to Syria and see how well it's working out? Well, you might know that there was a gas attack in Syria on August 21st. And yes, on August 21st, 22nd, there were some questions about exactly what happened. But increasingly, in the weeks after that August 21st attack, there was voluminous media coverage on this event. I was actually in China. Last night I was telling folks I'm running a China conference in November. I was in China on August 21st when this event happened. And yes, I'm being emailed by people in the media, but when I came back on the plane on Monday, what was it, the 24th or something of August, the moment I landed, because of all the work I've done here, I was like immediately inundated with the media. Are we going to bomb Syria? All those issues and so forth, which I know a fair bit about because of my my work. And then within a couple of days, I was flown to New York for 4 days on Al Jazeera, to be on Al Jazeera America around the clock, because we have just suddenly, well, what all that news media coverage was about, folks, was bringing fantastic attention to the atrocities that were happening in Syria. And in case you're wondering whether, we have the hard evidence, well, actually, we don't just have media coverage, but the UN report, which has come out, if you go to the appendices of the UN report, and that's what I'm going to show you, the actual hard evidence. I don't mean claims of the hard evidence. The hard evidence is really depicted in that report. So this is evidence of the pupil dilation of the victims who died. This is a standard characteristic of sarin, and this is in the UN report. These are the toxicology reports of the actual bodies from the autopsies. So this isn't just simply, again, claims of use of sarin. I mean, this is what it means to actually verify that sarin was being used. And then on top of that, you probably noticed that after the UN report, Vladimir Putin suddenly stopped complaining. Well, there's a good reason why he suddenly stopped complaining. Go to the appendix of the UN report, and you're going to find some really interesting evidence, not only that Assad's shells, that the chemical weapons are fired by Assad shells, but the Russian on the shells. So suddenly, maybe Mr. Putin doesn't really want us looking too hard at exactly where those shells came from, if you see what I mean. Anyway, if you go and look, you'll see that as close to beyond a reasonable doubt as we could ever have, we know sarin gas was used. We know, as beyond a reasonable doubt as we could have, that it was used by Assad's government. And nonetheless, we're not using force to intervene. Think about that for a moment. What's wrong here? We've just followed those steps of Samantha Power's theory. But we're not intervening. In fact, she's proposing we intervene. She got the president to talk about intervening, and we're not intervening. Okay? Let's just kind of expand this a little bit more. The evidence has been indisputable. Let me just be clear. But we haven't acted. This is a problem from hell that fits her model of the problem from hell. This is Samantha Power herself involved in running the policy as close as could be, and it's not working. I tell you folks, the problem here is not an execution of strategy. I think the problem is more fundamental with the approach. And let me just broaden this out a little bit. The fundamental issue with this approach is it assumes that in a democracy, it's public opinion that's going to drive humanitarian intervention. Public opinion. And that would mean, if that were true, that we should see a strong relationship between public opinion for intervention and actual intervention, right? Let's look at those relationships. Now, we don't have a huge N to go for. We don't have 300 cases. So we can't do what Jenna's like marvelous at large N studies. We can't do the Jenna study on this exactly. But we can look very closely at the handful of cases that we do have both ways. And what I've done is I've arrayed them for you in the order of public support for intervention. And what you're going to see is there's no relationship between public support for intervention and our actual decision to intervene. In the case of Rwanda, one of the high points here for public intervention, the elites in the Clinton administration did not intervene. They just simply did not intervene. In the case of Libya, there never was strong public support for the intervention, and that 39%, folks, is after Obama decided to intervene. Normally you get a rally around the flag effect, which is when the president decides to go. We're all patriotic and we say, yes, Mr. President, we're going to support you. Not in Libya. Not in Libya. And having talked to folks in the West Wing about this, man, they are really bummed out about it. And why don't they talk about the great success of Libya and the humanitarian intervention? Because it's a political loser with the public, not just Republicans. One of the things that you might find really ironic is go look at the old tapes of Jon Stewart on The Daily Show and how Jon Stewart thought about the Libya intervention. You would have thought that he was coming from the Tea Party. Okay, completely opposed to the humanitarian intervention. You know, heaven forbid we save 10,000, 50,000 lives in Benghazi, okay? But that's just to show you that public support here is not the problem. Yes, sir.
You went with a poll from April for Syria.
Pardon me?
You went with a poll from April for Syria?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's August. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, that's supposed to be, that's August. That's my mistake in just typing it up last night, or the night before, actually. So no, I take it back. No, it's not April, it's August. And it's actually, if I remember right, it's August 28th, just to be really precise. So it's like a full week after the event, and when it's clear that Obama is going to, everybody thought before Obama pulled back, we were going to bomb. You see what I mean? So that rally around the flag effect should have been occurring at that point, sir. But thank you for catching the typo. But the bottom line here is that there's something missing from the Syria debate. And that's what I want to present. I want to present an alternative way to think about the conditions for humanitarian intervention. And then I want to apply them to cases where we've succeeded and cases where we haven't. And I want to talk about what I call the pragmatic standard of humanitarian intervention. The pragmatic standard of humanitarian intervention has 3 pillars. The first pillar is mass homicide. So it agrees with the standard liberal theory of humanitarian intervention that mass homicides are the crucial thing that we are trying to prevent and to stop and to save lives. That's absolutely true. And it also agrees with their reading of Kant that we should begin with a principle that we are all individuals of equal worth in a community of all mankind. But where it departs is it actually goes on to read the rest of Kant. So the usual theories of humanitarian intervention like to quote Kant and just kind of strip out a single sentence from Kant. Well, actually, as Jenna knows, I began my career many years ago as a graduate student in political theory. Not actually in IR. And at the University of Chicago, I get to teach one of my 4 courses every year in our great Common Core, where I get to teach Kant. I get to teach Hobbes. I get to teach. So I basically get to teach the thing I loved in the first place, which was political theory. And what's really stunning is to kind of read Kant. Kant has lots of material about saving others or saving strangers. This is a problem he thought a lot about. But he did not think it was an unconditional duty, meaning that you should execute that duty under all circumstances at all times. That in his lexicon would be called a perfect duty, what you must always do and never violate. Kant also, for those of you who know Kant, is famous for having imperfect duties, which are duties you should fulfill under some conditions, but not all the time. Saving others is a version, it falls in the category of an imperfect duty. That is, for Kant, he really thought quite hard about the conditions under which you would save others. And let me just give you more of a real-world individual example and then we'll be a little clearer with the actual pillars. So let's say that I'm on the street right in front of the Georgia Tech Hotel and Conference Center where Jenna has just picked me up, and there's a busy street right there. And there's a woman who's pushing a baby carriage across the street, and she loses control of it, and the baby carriage is going out, and there are cars coming at 50 miles an hour. And that baby, if it is definitely going to die unless some intervention happens, and the only possible intervention is for me to rush out into the street and push the baby away, but that car is coming at 50 miles an hour, so extremely likely I'm going to die as a result of that intervention. So, should I intervene to save the baby? Okay? The way Kant would answer that question is it depends on the prior promises I have already made in my life. This is an emergency, one that has come out of the blue, could not have been expected. But here I am, an adult. I have 3 children. I've made promises to the welfare of my 3 children that I'm going to ensure their welfare over the course of their whole lives. So the problem for Kant and the way he thinks about this is that new event, that's the emergency event, you might, under some circumstances, go and save that baby even if it means you die, but not if it means you violate a promise to save someone else's life. That is, to protect other people. Because promises for that are very important for Kant. Those are perfect duties. We're not in a world, in Kant's world, where we can just willy-nilly, on our own accord, violate those past promises. Because in his view, the violation of past promises breaks down all the social trust in society and basically does massive harm to that community of all mankind. So those past promises really matter quite tremendously. And so what that would mean is, and this is in his lexicon, that if the cost to the individual of executing the duty to save others are relatively low, then you must do it. Then you must do it. And if they're relatively high, then it really does depend on whether you've made other obligations to other people. And it's not good enough that you would say, yeah, my kids, they probably think fondly of their dad for having died that way. It's not good enough, folks, because that's just me deciding I get to break my promise whenever I want to. You know, and if I want to have the, you know, the nobility of dying that way, that's a benefit to me, right? That Kant would look at that and say, no, that's just being selfish. The real issue here, again, is there was a promise, and what are you going to do about those prior promises? And we as adults often have serious promises. So that's important. So anyway, how does that translate into thinking about humanitarian intervention? That means, in addition to the pillar of an ongoing existing mass homicide campaign that we're sure about, we should also have low-cost intervention plans. Low-cost intervention plans. And it's because we actually have an obligation. Our military forces, our political leaders, this is true in the United States, take an oath in office to defend the security of the United States. They are promising to do that. That is a moral promise. That is something that Kant would call a promise. And yes, that's why they're being elected, so it's a two-way street. The promise is also being accepted on the other side. And so this is not something that's just so easy to violate according to Kantian ethics, where we're just simply going to decide we're going to throw away 30,000 military lives to go save folks in Syria. No, that's not the trade. The real issue is violating the promise to the American public. That's the big deal. Yes, sir.
Can we also take into account that some of the best fighters in the Syria resistance are some of our terrorist enemies like Al-Qaeda?
We're getting there. We'll get there, sir. No, we're getting to we're talking about the moral principles first, okay, of intervention just in general, and we'll apply right to that point, sir. But there's a third issue. The third issue is, it may well be the case there's an ongoing mass atrocity. It may well be the case we have a short-term intervention plan to stop it in a snapshot. But what about the consequences for the public, the people we're saving, over time? Do we have an enduring security plan so that our intervention in the short term does not lead to an ungovernable chaos in the long term that kills many more people than the mass atrocity campaign in the first place? If we intervene in the short term and we do save a few lives, if we lose many more down the road because of our intervention, we're not morally ahead, we're morally behind. So I put forward there are really three pillars of humanitarian intervention. Number one, the existence of a mass homicide campaign. Number two, the existence of a viable, low-cost military intervention plan. And number three, a viable plan for long-term security. Notice how those other 2 points, by the way, the existence of a mass homicide campaign, ordinary people or journalists, they can pick that up. They don't need to work with folks who are, quote, knowledgeable about military affairs. 2 and 3, you have to actually work with other folks. So one of the big things I'm calling for here is a true working relationship between different parts of Washington for humanitarian intervention, which, by the way, does happen in those 4 cases where we've actually seen it. And let me talk about that, and let me apply this to Libya, because Libya is a clear case of the pragmatic standard at work, where all 3 of the pillars were met. And I would say, by the way, in all the 4 cases I talked about, the Kurds in northern Iraq, the Bosnian Muslims, the Muslims in Bosnia, the Muslims in Kosovo, these 3 pillars were met there as well. But let me talk about Libya. This map shows the Libyan revolution or uprising around February 28th, about 10 days after the Libyan uprising. Well, Larry knows, but not a lot of people know much about Libya. And one of the key things you might not know is, you might know that Libya is about twice the size of Texas. You might know it has about 6.5 million people. You might not know that most of Libya is just a gigantic sea of sand. People in Libya don't live all the way through Libya. In fact, it's impossible because the desert is so blisteringly hot throughout most of Libya. Nearly 85% of all the population of Libya lives in about a dozen cities just on the Mediterranean coast, and have for a long period of time. That is where the people of Libya live. And what you see here on this map, and I don't know if the colors are coming through as well, but the red are the cities that have broken away en masse from the Gaddafi regime. What you see is that within 10 days, 75% of the population of Libya broke away from Gaddafi. Not just a few, 75%. That's a massive area of control by the Libyan rebels. We could call it in technical terms a sanctuary. This is a massive area of control by the Libyan rebels. Now, you could look at this map, and by the way, I would suggest there were some folks, and I do think Samantha Power and Susan were some of those, who would look at a map like this and say, you know, just a little more push, we could actually get regime change in Tripoli. And if you go back and look at the New York Times right around February 28th, you're going to see there was a debate in Washington on the Obama administration about whether we should do regime change in Tripoli. You'll see there were proponents of that, and then you will see that there was an opponent, Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, who said if we do regime change in Tripoli, we're going to end up with an occupation. An occupation, and in fact, if you know my work from Suicide Terrorism, what defines an occupation is controlling the government, not the number of troops on the ground. An occupation, it's likely to produce a lot of terrorism, and that would be anti-American terrorism. And so we should not do regime change in Tripoli. Well, there was an alternative approach. The alternative approach was to recognize that even though this was the state of affairs on February 28th, it was really quite likely that Gaddafi, the state had disintegrated, but it was quite likely that Gaddafi would have enough force remaining that he would be able to start taking towns. And so the key issue was going to be, even though it wasn't even under threat on February 28th, Benghazi. The key issue was not Tripoli. It was going to be saving Benghazi. And that if we should reorient our policy, not for regime change in Tripoli, but humanitarian intervention in Benghazi. And moreover, the way to deal with Gates was not to say he was wrong, he's some evil realist and he's wrong. It's to say he's right for the goal of regime change in Tripoli, but wrong if we expressly reject regime change in Tripoli and support humanitarian intervention in Benghazi. And moreover, this was a mission that we had a clearly viable, low-cost intervention plan to execute. Because given that Libya is a gigantic sea of sand, there is only this area to protect, and it's only the road along the Mediterranean that you need to control. And if you go back and look at your military operations in World War II, you'll see that was true in World War II as well. There's been one real road to really protect. So what that meant was that if Gaddafi was going to take his 8,000 to 10,000 remaining loyal forces in about 400 to 500 vehicles and go and attack city after city after city in order to regain them, he was going to have to do it in one and only one way. There were not 15 different strategies. There was one strategy. That strategy was to have the armor columns go city to city to city to city. And so this was going to be extremely predictable. This was also going to be a mission that American offshore air power, both Navy and air, could handle and handle extremely well. Because hitting clusters of armor in open road, and basically we got them right there, cluster of armor in open road in desert environment that are very far away from, they're not co-located with urban areas, is the perfect mission for today's precision-guided Air Force. We have the sensors to do this, we have the air power to do this, and we did this extremely well, which is why we could basically run a 10-day air campaign and then, quote, lead from behind. Because our humanitarian intervention really succeeded in saving Benghazi. And then after that, that left the decision of what to do next, not up to the United States, not even up to the Europeans. it left the decision of what to do next up to the rebels in Libya. The rebels in Libya, from that point on, they were in control of, should they cut a deal with Gaddafi? Should they decide to topple Gaddafi on their own? They're the ones that made that decision. And truth be told, a big reason why the Republicans, especially the Republicans, were not interested in supporting this is because we didn't pick the replacement to Gaddafi. The rebels did. And there's a lot of complaining about that because people don't like the character, the nature of the rebels that have replaced Gaddafi. However, I just simply tell you that since this basically the conflict ended, there's been almost no violence in Libya. Almost no violence, okay? Yeah, there was some anti-American violence. I really do think it's too bad that the Libyan ambassador was killed. I don't mean to minimize that altogether. But the fact is, you have not had a bloodbath of 100,000 people die. You just haven't had that. This has been an extremely successful intervention, and it's been one that fits the dictates of the 3 pillars I just laid out. So let's now look at Syria. Syria is very different, very different. First, the main problem with Syria is not that we don't have some plans that would be low cost to intervene. The question is, do we have plans that would actually intervene in a way that would produce security for the people who are dying? As of now, about 100,000 people have died in Syria. And what I want to do is talk about some of the differences and explain why we're having such a hard time coming up with a viable intervention plan, both in the short term and for enduring security. First, what I want to do is show you the map of rebel activity in Syria. You could pick almost any map in the last year and you would see something very similar. This picture has hardly changed except by a half kilometer here or there. Basically, what you have is no large area of rebel control. Unlike Libya, where 75% of the population centers broke away, here you have bits and pieces of parts of the population centers breaking away. You don't have homogeneous areas of a sanctuary, of rebel control. You have divided control in area after area after area after area. This is an extremely difficult problem, an extremely difficult problem right from the get-go. But why is it there's been so much fragmented control? That's sort of the real underlying issue. There's really 2 structural problems in Syria that are constraining us that we have to deal with. Number one is, as this gentleman pointed out, the fragmented nature of the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition is an umbrella term that we use for about 36 opposition groups. And those opposition groups are very different entities. They're not only led by different leaders, but some are Kurdish, some are Sunni, some are Islamic, some are secular. You have a whole variety of different types of rebel groups. One of the rebel groups, al-Nusra, which has gone from being a teeny tiny one to increasingly a medium-sized one, is effectively the group that was funneling serious suicide bombers into Iraq during our occupation of Iraq to kill Americans in Iraq, and now has decided that they're going to turn their guns on the Assad regime. And by the way, if we decided to intervene with boots on the ground, they would love nothing better than going back to the old mission of killing Americans here, because that's just part and parcel of what they were, sort of organized to do in the first place. So we have a collection of rebels that are just barely organized and holding together against the common enemy of Assad that would actually be even more likely to unify against a common enemy against the United States as an intervening power. This is an extremely serious problem, which is fantastically limiting our ability to intervene. But that's only structural problem number one, the fragmented nature of the coalition. There's a second structural problem, which is even worse, which is the true underlying structural problem. This is a demographic map of Syria. you probably have never seen this particular map of Syria. It's not classified. It's just the type of map that doesn't typically show up in the newspapers, or on the media. Remember I told you that I went to Al Jazeera for those 4 days right after I got off the airplane? Well, I was there for 4 days, and so there's a lot of time to talk to the journalists in the newsroom and everything. And as they're interviewing us here, you know, and I just told the executive producer, I said, you know, do you want to see a map that explains why we can't solve this problem? And he kind of jokingly said, sure, you know, because he'd seen tons of maps. So I showed him this map, and then when I explained to him what I'm about to explain to you, he actually let me produce my own segment on Al Jazeera with Juan Cole. Juan and I did this ourselves. He assigned us a little team of people to kind of write a script and then to do the map design for this, and then we actually did the thing and everything. We produced our little segment. And Juan said he had never seen social science on TV. So we started calling it SSTV. And it was, and it's this type of a map that's really helpful in explaining the true underlying problem. And let me just kind of walk you through what you're seeing in the different colors. Well, first of all, there are 23 million people in Syria. About 17 million live in this western corridor of the country. And that's where the lion's share of the killing is occurring. And just in case you're wondering, only about 30% of this quantity of people are mobilized. Only about 30%. So as bad as things are in Syria, they can and probably will get a lot worse. A lot worse. We have not yet seen the peak of the civil war in Syria. The average civil war, folks, since World War II goes 8.5 years. We're only into 2 years here. Syria is certainly not minor compared to the average civil war. So this is, we may well have a long way to go with Syria. But what's happening inside of this map is you can see that there are different groups. There are Kurdish groups. There's Sunni groups. The Sunni are the yellow. There are Druze groups. Druze is a kind of a strange monotheistic religion that it's its own religion. This is the purple. There's the red. Those are the Christians. And then there's the dark green. They're the Alawites. They're the Shia, effectively, in Syria. We have at least 5 major groups. And notice how they are deeply intertwined in their settlement patterns. This phenomenon of having different ethnic groups that are deeply intertwined in settlement patterns, we've seen this type of problem before in Bosnia in the mid-1990s and in Baghdad from 2005 to 2008. When you have different ethnic groups that are deeply intertwined in settlement patterns, once you get any killing going, and it can get going for a whole variety of reasons, each of those groups starts to fend for themselves for their own security. You end up getting fragmented coalitions. You end up getting people switching sides. And it's because the nature of the security dilemmas, it's called when you have fragmented, intertwined ethnic groups, creates a cycle of violence that can fuel create fuel on its own that can spiral up and spiral up. That's what's been happening in Syria, and it's likely to continue to happen even if Assad falls. Many people would like to end this conflict with a single bullet. Oh, let's just get rid of Assad and everything will be fine. Once you understand the nature of the actual demographic problem, no, it's going to get worse if Assad falls. And let me just zero in on, so Assad's base, the base of the Alawites, is up on the northwest. That's the green. And that is a group of people, about 13% or so of the Syrian population, who are, they're pro-Assad, but more than anything else, they're pro-themselves. They're pro-themselves. The reason they're pro-Assad is because they really are a minority here, and they really are living in an area where they have a buffer zone between them and the Sunnis, but that buffer are the Christians. And what could easily happen here if Assad falls is that that community is going to start to feel increasingly vulnerable. And they're going to want to control increasingly the perimeter around their community, which means probably putting some of those Christians in the crosshairs. And the Sunnis on the other side of that are probably going to be in a similar situation. So this problem that I'm talking about, the demographic problem, is one that not only exists in that corridor as a whole, but specifically exists around the area that would be Assad's stronghold. And so therefore the hope or the notion that, yeah, we just topple Assad and everything is all hunky-dory, well, not for the mission of saving lives. Not for the mission of saving lives. This was always a very difficult problem, and I'm not telling you Assad's a nice guy, but I'm here to tell you what's the best plan to save lives, not simply get rid of an evil dictator. Let's kind of come back for a second. So what could we do? What would be a good idea? Well, the most important thing to do is to, as I told you, notice that this part of the country, even though there's already been 100,000 dead, this is probably about 10 times worse than Bosnia and 5 times worse than Syria. Than Baghdad. You could end up easily here with 500,000 people dying, not just simply 100,000. That would not be weird by the nature of this type of conflict. Moreover, you could end up with many more millions of refugees. And so you have to think about this. This is going to be a problem that's likely to get worse, even if Assad falls. And what are we going to do? Are we going to send those million refugees into Turkey? Are we going to send them into Lebanon? Are we going to send them into Jordan? We're not sending them into Israel. What are we doing here with the problem? I think what we should be focusing on are not ways to topple Assad. I think what we should be focusing on are ways to build enclaves or pockets of stability inside of Syria. I think that's the most important thing we should do. And specifically, what I would do is I would try to build pockets of stability inside of Syria around the areas that are already mostly homogeneous with respect to ethnic groups. So I would pick, for example, Aleppo, and I would concentrate economic aid and arms deliveries to expand the area of control of the rebels around the suburbs of Aleppo so that we could build an actual enclave of security that would not be offensively prone. I mean, Aleppo is a long way away from the stronghold here. So if you build an enclave of security, this is not really going to help you topple Assad in a direct sense. But what it is going to do is create an area of security for future refugees and for the population as a whole, and basically build stability or help stabilize the parts of the country that are the most stable. So over time, we could try to spread that stability to the less stable parts of the country. And that, I think, is a pragmatic way to intervene. I think that would save lives, and I think it would be the most we could do to save lives because the other options would likely be worse. And that's what that says on that last slide. So let me stop there and take your questions. Yes, sir?
Are you worried that as a second and possibly third order effect of creating pretty much ethnic strongholds would be that you further fragment the society going forward so that whoever does end up in charge would have a lot harder time consolidating power and ruling effectively?
Yeah, I would if we were talking about doing this from a standing start in 2010, but not now in 2013, and certainly not even, by the way, by the summer of 2011. So you're right that that is an issue, but we already are facing the disintegration of the state. Assad, I think, has virtually no hope of regaining control over the entire country of Syria. I'm not sure any group is going to be able to control the entire country of Syria. And it's because of the demographic problem I just laid out. If you looked at the demographics in Libya, you would see that there are different tribes. There are 11 main tribes in Libya, but they live not in intermixed areas like this. They actually live in their own puddles, their own pools. And that's why what you're seeing is fragmentation in Libya at the local level that's really pretty peaceful. You know, is it the best of the, is it, you know, like living here in Atlanta? No, I'd still rather live here. But it's actually nowhere near as ugly as what was going to happen in Benghazi. Here, what's happening is you're getting a lot of fragmentation and killing as we speak. And what I'm doing is trying to pull that back some. But you're right that a price of this is accepting that that fragmentation will probably go on for a long time. There's just no better alternative, I think. Yes, ma'am. Yep, yep, in the pink, blue, yep.
I'm curious to know your opinion on, I guess, the other argument that was being used for intervention, which was the need to punish the chemical weapons used to act as sort of deterrent to other regimes.
Yeah, I think those are pretty weak arguments. So first of all, the air plan that we were talking about, which was basically the 100 or so cruise missile Tomahawk attack plan, that was this limited airstrike option that we were describing. Once you see the demographic problem I've laid out, you can see how this is going to have no effect whatsoever on that. It may make it slightly worse, but it's certainly not going to actually touch any of the core issues that are occurring inside of the country. And you can also see that as a half measure, it would very likely persuade rebels inside the country that Americans are basically half-hearted and aren't really going to do anything. They're just going to do something to make themselves look good and then walk away. The problem, though, with the actual getting rid of the chemical weapons, I do think it would be wonderful to, in the near term, have the stocks of chemical weapons by Assad destroyed. I'm not really telling you that there's no value to that whatsoever, but I do think it's important for you to know that chemical weapons are incredibly easy to make. They're incredibly easy to make. Sarin nerve gas, you don't need 1,000 tons of chemical weapons to kill tens of thousands of people. Okay, a few gallons is going to go a long way, right? Even just simply 200 pounds would go a long way in Damascus or Aleppo, probably putting tens of thousands of people at risk, even with just 200 pounds. That's something that's going to be fairly easy to reproduce at these lower levels unless we truly were able to control all the soap plants, all the fertilizer plants, all the areas of processing that could be used inside the country for this. So I'm not thinking that we're about to, completely wipe those chemical weapons away. However, I do think that what the main benefit here is that what we've mainly done is driven a wedge between Assad and Russia. So the most important thing I thought, so when I got off that plane, the most important thing I thought was we shouldn't be talking about bombing. We should be organizing our diplomacy to drive a wedge between Russia and Syria. And it's because even Russia would have a hard time publicly supporting an ally that was gassing its people on the spot at the moment. And yes, the leader could say, oh, there's no evidence, there's no evidence, there's no evidence. But look at how, you embarrass the Russians enough and you put them in this position, even the crass Russians are going to have a hard time doing that. And that's the main thing, ma'am, we really get out of this, which is we've driven this wedge here between Russia and Syria, which is why I think Syria is coming forth with those chemical weapon sites. It's because they don't want to lose the Russians. They need the Russians. Yes, sir.
I have two questions actually.
Yep, that's okay.
First is, which party do you think would be the most efficient to do that in place of security? Is it the United States, or is it the Arab League, Russia maybe, or any other party?
Well, the United States, so the reason everybody, sometimes people wonder, why is it always the United States? Why is it always the United States? Well, because we are the world's sole superpower. We are the biggest state on the planet. We're the 800-pound gorilla. We really are the easiest state to build cooperation or coalition around. It's not that it's impossible exactly to have other coalitions. It's just that it's much easier for us to bring others along, and also then to coordinate actions that actually work. We've seen collections of African countries try to intervene in Sudan and Darfur, and what we've seen is they've come kind of too little too late at the end of the game when there's not much to do, and so it's not exactly that nobody else can do it. It's that there really are some tremendous advantages for the United States. I think that that's why it tends to be, we tend to be at the center of that discussion. However, I would point out that in the case of Libya, I thought it was terribly important that we build a coalition that involved the key regional actors here, because having an international coalition, there's actually two fundamental reasons that are very helpful for this. Number one, if it's a unilateral humanitarian intervention, it's going to be easy for the rest of the world to think that we, especially the United States, have an ulterior power motive for doing it. That even if it looks like we're doing humanitarian intervention, as long as it's just us doing it, man, there's got to be, the rest of the world's going to be deeply suspicious. And they're going to think, oh, there's some realist advantage here that they're really getting out of this, and we just don't know it. All right? So the coalition, on one hand, is a check on the ambition of any of the partners. Number two, though, with the regional actors in particular, if there are going to be costs, things that go wrong, often they're going to affect the regional actors first. So we don't want to be in a position where we have a double standard, where basically we say, yeah, we're Americans, we just don't die because we're sort of somehow Westerners or Americans. It's okay for the regional folks to, like pick up the pieces when we leave it behind. That's not a good policy to be in. So you want to have a combination of, you want to have a coalition for a variety of purposes, and you want to have different parts of a coalition in different areas. Second question?
The second question is, do you think a confessional agreement between the different groups is possible, like the one that happened in Lebanon after the Civil War?
I think that under current conditions, that agreement would not be worth the paper it'd be signed on. It would be a pie crust agreement, easily made, easily broken. So in the case of Bosnia, which is one where we actually had the Dayton Accords, we actually had a confessional-based agreement. That happened in fall of 1995. After the structural conditions of the demographic problem was largely fixed, was largely solved. So Bosnia initially from 92 to 95 looked like this intermixed area, and you couldn't stop the killing and so forth and so on. But if I showed you the maps of where people ended up, you would see that they ended up in essentially homogeneous areas, that the war moved them, separated peoples into these homogeneous areas, and that the Dayton Accord line was to the half kilometer along the borders of those areas. And so this is something that's, so I call for these middle ground positions. So realists think I'm a liberal, liberals think I'm a realist, okay, nobody can, so if realists won't pay enough attention to the mass atrocities, the liberals won't pay enough attention to what you have to do to save people. Okay, and the real structural change has to occur. It's not just good. It's not enough to just get people in a room to sign a piece of paper. At least I don't think so, to be blunt. I'm putting it a little crudely, but the truth is, I think it has to be married more to the real structural conditions on the ground. Yes, sir.
So it was really a surprise to hear you assess Libya and how that went ahead. I had the impression that the security situation in Libya was quite bad.
Yeah. Fox News is just, the media is just, yeah, you ought to go and look at the number of people that are actually dying, or read Juan Cole's blog. I mean, the truth is, what you're hearing is not being calculated according to the people that are dying. I mean, go and it's we live in a world where I honestly think there are more people dying in Washington Park, which is the community right near the University of Chicago, than in most of the major population centers of Libya. They're under, however, pretty tight control by the local militias, the tribal militias, in each of those areas. So it's not the case that this is a wide open democracy that's easy to be comfortable in. I'm not telling you that. But what I am telling you is that the security condition here is is not what I suspect most Americans think it is, from the constant reference to, quote, the awful conditions in Libya. What people, I think, what Fox is really upset about, I think, is that a number of pro-Islamic groups, that is explicitly Islamic groups that are interested in Sharia law, that are just pro-Islamic, are getting a lot of public support in Libya. And you saw this in Egypt. That is, you see basically that we have a situation where the median voter in the Middle East is very Islamic. Okay, and we'd like to believe that's not true. Actually, I'm not really sure that that's exactly true in Syria, but it's true in many areas of the world, and I think that's probably true in Libya.
Just
Yes,
a
sir.
quick question. I read it. I'm not just doing. I don't just do Fox.
Well, okay, I didn't mean to insult you. Sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to insult you, but well, just the numbers don't bear it out, sir. We don't have. It's not a, okay. I was just trying to say it in a way that most people could remember, and I'm sorry if I insulted you, and I really didn't mean to, and I apologize. I did not mean to.
It's a lack of security in Libya that allowed the large stockpiles of weapons to go into the hands of people who were not pro-democracy, and then it filtered into places like Mali and sub-Saharan Africa that caused a lot of issues. In the Syria case, with all of the chemical weapons, they may look at Libya and say, hey, that is something that may not have been an awesome experience for us, and they see some of the things that went bad there, and they see it going magnified to the nth degree in Syria. And I think a lot of the...
Well, sir, what I would say is if we had let the 70 to 100,000 people get slaughtered in Benghazi, what we would have found was an even more massive exodus of people from Libya. Those stockpiles, sir, were not protected by the Gaddafi regime during that period of time. In fact, what Gaddafi had done is he had opened his stockpiles, because what he was asking the population of Libya to do, sir, was in fact to go and get those stockpiles and kill what he was hoping. He called them the cockroaches that were the rebel groups that were opposing him. So, sir, I definitely hear you that there's an issue with those stockpiles. What I would tell you, what I think is that issue would either have been the same or worse had we let the 100,000 people of Benghazi get slaughtered. So I just don't buy that the right thing to do to avoid the problem you just laid out was to stand aside while Benghazi got nailed. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Maggie.
Very interesting. We'd like to take your best plan there and ask you to sort of, you've probably done this already, but play it out what that looks like, particularly in the context of your slides earlier where you were citing the reasons or the lack of correlation between public support for humanitarian intervention, and noting that one of the current ones is, fatigue with deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan,
right,
as well as a whole number. So, I mean, how do you see that best plan? I mean, do you see it looking like?
Well, here's what I think. You mean this slide here on that?
No, there was one that you had that you cited. I forget the exact verbiage, but basically is why we're not interested in going to Syria. Fatigue from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, so it's the 42% number. This was not April, but August. Right. So basically it boils down, Maggie, I think what you're asking is what would happen with that 42% number in the public. And what I think, having studied not only this humanitarian intervention, but having been involved in advocating for saving the Muslims in Bosnia in the mid-1990s, is that the real decisions that are happening with elites in Washington, typically in the White House. And although we'd like to believe in a democracy, public opinion drives all the decisions of our elites. I think it drives some and not others. I think that the fact is that the successful humanitarian interventions typically are successful, and then the public really forgets about them. The public does not give our leaders credit for them. But if things go bad, if there is like a total disaster where in the case of Somalia we have Black Hawk Down, and then what's happening is it's not a low-cost intervention plan, it looks like another disaster for the military, and the military then looks like it's being sucked into an area where it's not going to be able to fulfill its other commitments to protect us in other ways. Now all of a sudden that's a pretty big disaster. So what I would tell you is that I think the moral case for humanitarian intervention that I put forward is pretty similar to the political case for it. It's just that if we're expecting politicians to do it because they'll get political credit, I think that's a mistake. At the end of Samantha Power's book, she says we have to find a way to give politicians, democratically elected politicians, political credit for doing humanitarian intervention. I just think that's not going to happen, and I don't think that's what happened in the cases where we succeeded. Obama administration went into Libya. They knew it was a political loser. They decided to manage the costs of this with the public, and Obama got reelected. Okay? That's what I see with humanitarian intervention. It's not actually going to help him get reelected. It's just the question is, can he do it in a way that doesn't cost him an election? Yes, Larry.
So, what do you think could, basically be your own critic, what do you think could go wrong? Both interested both kind of domestically, what kind of wild cards might be thrown out there, or even internationally, what effects might this have on other players in the region?
The number one issue, the reason I'm talking more about this plan now than, I did a piece in the New York Times about a year ago, and I said that it wasn't time to intervene then. The reason is because one of the downsides here is much less, which is Russia in particular. So one of the absolute big issues here with any intervention plan whatsoever, including the one I'm putting forward, Larry, you say the downside is that if an intervention plan like this were to trigger even more massive Russian intervention, especially direct military intervention on the side of Assad. And what I think now is if we were going to actually, I think now we have at least a possible environment to implement this plan, because as I said, I think we've driven a wedge between somewhat of a wedge, I want to be careful, between Assad and Russia, and I think that it may well be possible to get a serious discussion with the Russians about building enclaves of stability inside the country, because I think that we could really make a pretty good case that this would help contain the internationalization or spread of the conflict outside the borders. Now that may be a bigger problem than I'm crediting right now, but you're right. There are potential downsides, red flags that I already see, and the one that I would focus on the most actually here would be with the Russians. Yeah. Oh no, go please. Please respond. I mean, if you see others, I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, I was just interested in part because you had mentioned that you'd also been with Turkey too. But I was thinking two other major, I think the major players here, both at the larger level strategically, we'll say Iran, but you can focus your comments on Turkey. Thinking about, though it hasn't, we've created an autonomous zone in Iraq over a period of time. Well, I think the thoughts about having this this new Kurdish state in Kurdistan, whatever it is, and the affinities that you have across 3 or 4 different states might be overblown. There's still something to it, I think, from the perspective or perception of, say, Turkey, thinking, oh, there may be something in northern Syria that could, for some reason, connect with the other.
Well, so I guess I would say, yeah. So with Libya, I was really in the case of the Libya issue, Turkey had the role that Russia does for me with Syria, and the reason is this: in saving Benghazi, it wasn't just simply the use of air power. It was really important to open up economic lifelines from Europe to the eastern part of Libya that would be open up the ability to have the economic wherewithal of the Libyan rebels to sustain themselves independently for a long period of time. Those economic lifelines between Europe and Libya had already pre-existed, and so we already knew a fair bit about how those trade routes and so forth worked, and Turkey was a central piece of that. So that's where, in the earlier one, I was really focused a lot on Turkey. Here, I do think Turkey is an issue, which is why I wasn't really pushing for a Kurdish autonomous zone inside of Syria. And my thought here is that there'll be always some issue with any autonomous zone anywhere for Turkey. But if the choice is where you have refugees could be flooding into Turkey versus into a Sunni autonomous zone, I would think that it should be pretty clear that the choice for Erdogan should be closer, should be the plan I'm suggesting here, because an alternative where you still have more problems directly inside your own country of Turkey, I don't think is good.
I think, oh, that's interesting, because you mentioned, that's when you mentioned calling that whole, including the northern part, a Sunni autonomous.
Yeah.
Coaching like that, I would imagine, would be much more agreeable to Erdogan.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. So I'm really trying to start this idea of a stable enclave with what is most likely to work, and then see if over time it could spread. But I'm not trying to tell you that I'm not trying to paint for you this like perfect solution that's going to like cleanly stop this war altogether. I'm sort of like trying to come in with what I think is a way to to minimize the growth of the problem as it goes on. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, why don't you consider Daraa as a place for a humanitarian enclave? Because it's closer to Jordan, and Jordan, you know,
yeah, it's not crazy. Yeah, it's not crazy. It's not crazy. I'm not. Yeah. There are definitely some other possible areas here that we could pick. And it may well be that if we could establish this once, we might be able to establish it successfully elsewhere. So I don't literally mean to tell you that it's the one and only one place, but I guess I'm taking the position, ma'am, that right now we have, I think, really no real good idea about how to do anything. I'm trying to find a limited plan that I think we could really quite plausibly end up saving lives. It would make a positive contribution, and I don't want to though paint it as so ambitious in so many different parts of the country that we couldn't get to even stage 1 of this plan. That might be a good thing to consider for like stage 2 or stage 3 if we could create a serious sanctuary area at all. Yep. Oh, well, actually, Katja. Yeah, please, Katja.
I have a couple. One, how do you actually physically go about creating such an enclave of stability?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to bring in ground troops and so on?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think that, first of all, it is definitely the case that even if you had to airdrop the supplies, you could do this. I mean, this wouldn't be the preferred option. The obvious option would be to try to work with some of the Kurdish groups to basically allow passage, and you'd have to give some supplies to them or bribe them as well. But certainly not ground troops. But even if you told me that political option, my preferred option to do it, was off the table, this is the type of mission that is small enough, localized enough, that we would be able to do it basically from a distance. If we make this too ambitious, then the answer is going to be no. Yeah.
And
the second?
The other one is I'm trying to apply your 3-pillar model to Rwanda.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah. Well, if I do the book, that's...
atrocities, but then
yeah.
Where does it fail? Is it too costly, or there's concern?
Oh, no, actually, I think it's more the other way around. So I may do a book on this. I'm very interested in doing a book, and what I would try to show is that Rwanda couldn't have met all 3 pillars. No, the opposite. It's not that we were right to stay out of Rwanda. It's that we were actually wrong. And it's, again, the failure to consider this pragmatic middle and the true pillars that really matter, as opposed to the liberal model. So I actually think there's a strong case that actually fits. Yeah, until having actually done the analysis, I want to be a little bit careful, but having done some preliminary work on this analysis, and a good shorthand way to think about this is that if you look at Cooperman's book, which is the biggest, the book that's most against the idea of intervening in Rwanda, and you look carefully at the details, you'll see that if you just take his analysis of what we could have done just with the air option, and not wait until it's defined as a genocide, but start at the point on April 10th when it's clearly a mass homicide, and you just take his timeline and you just take that, his analysis, and you just start it on April 10th, you end up saving 200,000 more people. And that's even, that's with Cooperman, who may not be giving the most credit because he doesn't even allow for the RP. So in his models, he does not even allow for a local ground ally like the RPF. And so there's that I would suggest is a lower bound on what could probably have happened in Rwanda. It may have been the case that we could have done actually substantially better than that. But I'm just giving you, so I think Rwanda is more on the other side. I think that looking at the best analysis at the moment, that's the critical analysis, Cooperman, all you have to do is just change the start point and everything does a lot better. And I think if you would also allow for the use of the RPF, which would be a ground ally, because that's a Tutsi ground ally, you would have possibility of even doing better than that. So I think that the issue with the pragmatic standard is that there are going to be cases where focusing on the pragmatic standard, you would have done more intervention than we currently did. So I actually think the liberal model is just simply standing in the way of saving lives. I think it's just simply a fundamental, it's a theory, and the theory doesn't work. Yeah.
Just to follow up on the first question that Kata hit, can this enclave plan work without any U.S. military involvement? It seems to me that you can support these people by drops from the air, but what if Assad attacks? Are you going to try to establish no-fly zones or some sort of humanitarian corridor or something?
Yeah, well, at the moment, there's no, there are no signs that, there's a strong reason to believe that the Al-Tawid Brigade would be able to defend, with additional support, would be able to defend a lot of the perimeters of what I'm talking about. But let's say that those calculations aren't true. If we have a perimeter defense that's not in the center of Aleppo, but around the suburbs of Aleppo, now we're talking about a perimeter defense that air power could support, that is American air power could support. The problem at the moment is that what people are thinking about an air option, it's an aggressive air option, is an air option that would allow us to somehow support taking of urban areas inside the urban areas. That's not a winner with air power. That's the lines of sight, there's like a lot of technical reasons why that is, we are right to resist that, and that would be a bad idea. That doesn't mean that establishing perimeter defenses broader can't be defended. They certainly can, and they're just simply a different type of air problem. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to extend. What I'm trying to do is not just create a tiny little pocket. I'm trying to extend a rather large area here. Do you see what I mean? It's not a teeny tiny little area. It's not just a neighborhood and helping one neighborhood take another neighborhood. I'm really trying to, help establish a reasonably significant enclave with a real sanctuary, which would have a perimeter, which the rebels, we do have in that area some sizable number of rebels. The Al-Tawid Brigade is one. And then if necessary, and it may be necessary, then air power could support that perimeter.
Yeah, well, what I hear from friends on Facebook, Aleppo is doing fine. They're organizing themselves. Aleppo is a big city. Now you look at the people now in the suburb of Damascus, they're dying from hunger.
Yes, no, I know. Damascus is a...
this is really a much more priority than, let's say, Aleppo, in my opinion.
You're right. You're right. So as in the case of Libya, I'm calling for stabilizing the most stable part of the country first. And I realize that there would appear to be simply more urgent need, but it's simply more difficult to do. So, and I just would point out that in the case of Libya, it looked like on February 28th, the problem was Tripoli. And then it became Benghazi 3 weeks later. I'm just simply say that I think the best approach here would be to focus on, you're right, the most stable part of the country. And let's do that first. And it has its own problem. I mean, we're already seeing, people are already picking the problems on that, right? So we've got to get the Russians involved. What are we going to do about the defenses? And, let's actually see if this can work. And then we can, become more ambitious. And I hear you that there there are people dying, but my point is that if we're going to come in, we have to come in a way that's actually going to lead to the savings of lives, as opposed to a case where we come in, we make a further mess, and then we just throw our hands up.
Let me have just one thing.
Let her have the final word.
I'm sorry. CARE, the organization, care.org, if you go, there is a petition for the Congress to increase humanitarian aid to Syria. So,
Good for CARE. Good for CARE.
I was going to say, we probably have time for one more question.
Okay.
Anyone have one?
Yep, you got it.
All right. I would just want to go back to the Pragmatic Standard
Okay.
for humanitarian intervention, and I wanted to take it to Burma. Which one of the three factors that is lacking in Burma for humanitarian intervention?
Yeah.
Knowing that the cases can pose to Bosnia or Kosovo.
Yeah. The enduring security is the biggest problem, just in a simple term. If you go to my if you go to the table in the IS piece, you'll see I try to apply this standard, and if you really get interested, I could send you, there's like a 50-page appendix where I go through those 3 pillars and apply them to those cases. And if you want to see how I've really done that, you can see that. But often, actually, the enduring security is often more difficult than we often take for granted here. And that was one of the big problems, by the way, in Bosnia, is that we had to have the structure fit the enduring security. But let me just stop there. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody. Great questions. Really good questions. Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.